Hi, and happy Hanukkah, everybody. My name is Linda Levy, and I'm the director of the Jdc Archives. I'm delighted to welcome you to this public lecture sponsored by the Jdc Archives in partnership with the Center for Jewish History in the context of the Martin and Rhoda Safer Jdc Archives Fellowship Program. The Jdc Archives, which houses the records of JDC since its creation 102 years ago, is one of the most important repositories for modern Jewish history. Visiting scholars from around the world utilize our unique offerings for their research, as do publishers, filmmakers, family researchers, curators, and others. I invite you to visit our online website at archives.jdc.org. For those of you involved in scholarship, there is a list of our digitized collections outside of the table that you might be interested in seeing. I'd like to recognize the Center for Jewish History for co-sponsoring and hosting the program today, and to invite Judy Greenspan, Director of Public Programs at the Center, to give greetings.
So welcome everybody to the Center for Jewish History. I'm Judy Greenspan. I started here recently, and it has been a very fascinating start. And certainly the word archive is very important to us here as well. So just a very brief overview of the Center for Jewish History. As most of you know, we are a consortium of 5 partner organizations. So under one roof is reflected an amazing diversity of Jewish history, Jewish experience, as is reflected in the programs we do here, in the gallery exhibits, and certainly in the archives. So I don't know if you're familiar with these numbers, but I always enjoy telling this part. Our archives, which is the partners archives all together, is in a massive collection, one of the largest collections of Jewish historical material outside of Israel, and these are really some fun numbers. We have 5 miles of archival materials in 6 languages that reflect 500 years of history, 50,000 digitized photographs, and 500,000 books. So it's really quite a fascinating place for people to come. Scholars come here, the public comes here. We have a genealogy room, a reading room, and as I said, many programs in the evening and during the week. So welcome. And downstairs where you signed in, we left some materials about some of our new series that are coming up here. So please take some of that literature on your way out and enjoy the program. Thank you.
I'd like to tell you a little bit more about this fellowship. The Martin and Rhoda Safer Jdc Archives Fellowship was established in 2016 by the family of Brian and Faye Safer in loving memory of Brian's parents to recognize the importance of the educational efforts of the JDC. One fellowship was awarded for each of 2 years to a deserving scholar engaged in graduate-level, postdoctoral, or independent study to conduct research in the JDC archives, and this is the second of those 2 years. Our speaker today, Omri Tubi, was awarded this fellowship for 2017. Our format is that our guest speaker will speak for 45 minutes, and then we'll have about 15 minutes for questions and discussion. Our speaker, Omri Tubi, is a PhD candidate in the sociology department at Northwestern University and the recipient of this fellowship. His field of interest is the sociology of medicine. He is using the fellowship towards his research on the relationship between public health campaigns and state formation in mandatory Palestine. Mr. Tubi grew up in Kibbutz Mabarot in Israel's Pfeffer Valley. In fact, malaria eradication in the valley will be mentioned in his talk. He completed his undergraduate studies in sociology, anthropology, and history at Bar Ilan University, and then continued at Tel Aviv University for his master's degree in sociology and anthropology. About 2.5 years ago, he came to begin his doctoral studies to Chicago to begin his doctoral studies at Northwestern. As a dissertation project, he plans to examine the flow of medical knowledge, practices, policies, and people from the United States to Mandatory Palestine, as well as to gain an understanding of the mobilization of American Jewry for the project of building a medical infrastructure in the country. His topic for the lecture today is the Transnational Roots of the Jewish State. What can malaria eradication teach us about the history of Israel? Well, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Omri, please.
Hi, thank you all for coming. The title changed a little bit, as you can see. So it's the circulation of medical knowledge and practice from the United States to Mandatory Palestine. First, I want to thank the JDC for their support, and especially Linda and Abra and Isabel and Misha for helping me getting all the documents that I need, and even if it means leaving the office and going to the fortress just because I asked, it's much appreciated. And also, thank you for the Center for Jewish History. I was here once. I will probably be here many more times. A lot of these, the documents for this talk and for my work in general are actually from the JDC's online collection. It was very helpful that I could sit at home after work and just download PDFs, so thank you. Okay, anyway, I'll start. I'm focusing on malaria eradication, but I am planning to expand to other areas of medical and health. This presentation will have two parts, and it will focus on the circulation of medical and scientific knowledge that has to do with malaria eradication, and a certain form of practice. So what I would argue is that this knowledge and the practice move from the United States, or are imported from the United States, to Palestine beginning of the 1920s.
You said you would lower the lights, and we want to see the slide.
They're working on it right now.
Okay. So as you can see, this photo, the one close to me, is from the Panama Canal. The one next to it is from Pfeffer Valley, and the guy that is kind of standing, his name is Grisha. He was from my kibbutz. He is throwing larvicide or some kind of pesticide on the Alexander Stream that runs through the valley. I know his grandson. He's a year younger than me. There is a connection between Alexander Stream and the Panama Canal, as counterintuitive as it might sound. I will get to that right away or shortly. So I'll start with the circulation of knowledge. Here's the case. I will focus on the Malaria Research Unit, or the MRU, that was formed in 1922 and disbanded in the early 1930s. Okay. It was a collaboration of the British administration and the Joint Distribution Committee. The Joint actually paid for the unit. Some said that it's paid the whole amount for the maintenance of the unit. Some say 66%, but basically maintained by the Joint. It was the most important scientific, anti-malarial scientific research unit in Palestine. There were other bodies that did anti-malarial work, but in terms of science, that was the most important body. And it laid the scientific foundations for eradicating malaria in the mandate period and later in the state period. It was headed by Israel Kliegler, which is this guy. I'll take the opportunity that I'm in New York to say I think he has family in New York. If any of you know them, they might have his letters, something, diaries, please let me know. Thank you.
I would really appreciate if they could lower it a bit more. I would really want to see the slides.
Move back a little bit, you'll be able to see it.
Okay, so regarding Panama, the Malaria Research Unit basically advocated the same methods that were used in the Panama Canal. I'll give you maybe a little bit more overview, a little bit more background about the unit. The unit was formed in 1922, as I said, but its origins are in 1919, when Louis Brandeis visits Palestine. He sees the conditions in the country, he sees how bad the malaria situation is, and he basically goes back to the United States. There's a Zionist convention in Chicago when he returns, and he basically says, he baffles all of his friends, all of his colleagues, and he says, we have to stop everything, because if we don't treat malaria, then all is lost. And the reason that he knows, or the reason that he feels like it, is because he was a boy in Kentucky. Kentucky had malaria. He knows what malaria can do, so it brings him back to his childhood, I guess. He makes a donation to start examining the possibility of eradicating malaria in Palestine. So there's in initial experiments, they have good results, and then the Malaria Research Unit is formed. It's headed by Kliegler. As I said, it's a part of the British administration, basically because the British interests in Palestine are caring about the British, okay? And if you will help them develop Palestine as economically as you can, for example, if you come and say, I will provide external assistance and pay for a certain anti-malaria unit, they would say, fine. They left a lot of room for like the more local actors to grow when it comes to providing services. So when the JDC made the offer of we will maintain a research unit, they were very happy to save money, okay? And their notion of economizing will be very important in the second part of the talk. But I'll go back to the unit and to one of my main protagonists, which is Kliegler. So Kliegler he was a child immigrant from Eastern Europe. He came to the United States with his family. And he got his doctorate degree at Columbia. He was actually at Northwestern for 9 months at the medical school, and he later worked at the Rockefeller Foundation, which also included work in Peru and in Mexico. And only later, in the early 1920s, 1921, give or take, he came to Palestine. But as early as 1918, while he is still in the Rockefeller Foundation, he already had some thoughts on sanitation in the country and the medical conditions in the country. And he wrote a report on Palestine's sanitary conditions where he basically says, if we want to build a state, if we want to build a Jewish state, we need to go for the same scientific methods that were used in Panama. I don't have the smoking, what they call the smoking gun evidence about it, but he was a scientist. He worked in Peru, he worked in Mexico. The excavation of the Panama Canal was huge at the time, so I would assume that he was very well acquainted with the methods that were used there. So Kliegler basically says the conditions, the sanitary conditions in Palestine are really bad, and he blames the Ottomans that ruled Palestine before World War I. He said they didn't take care of the sanitary conditions, and this is why people are so sick. And people were very sick. If you look at morbidity rates in the early 1920s, they're very high, and the numbers are terrifying. over 100, over 200%, which basically means that people they were constantly sick. They came down with malaria a number of times a year. And it was a real problem, because if you want to settle the land, you need people to work, okay? You need people to work to maintain a certain settlement. It wasn't necessarily that malaria is going to kill you, but you need to be able to sustain people in a certain place. It's like as basic as that. So Kliegler blames the Ottomans' bad government for its policies, and he says if we want to bring immigration, the current conditions are really dangerous. He said we have to centralize sanitary work, and he even offered a brief outline for how a health department would look. And he argues, and that's a quote, "The success of a state depends on the healthy conditions under which the inhabitants form their tasks." And he quotes a British politician and former prime minister from the 19th century, if I'm not mistaken, Benjamin Disraeli, excuse me, that writes, "Public health is the foundation upon which rests the happiness of the people and the power of the state, and if it's not achieved, then the nation must perish. The first duty of the statesman is the care for the public's health." He also discusses the scientific method that he wants to use to go about this and eradicate malaria and its origins. And he says, we need to attack the malaria transmitting vector, which is the Anopheles mosquito. An immigrant population, he writes, without prior exposure to the disease quickly falls prey to the infections and is liable to be decimated. This happened in Panama when the French attempted to build a canal. This happened in Palestine in the early days of colonization. This is bound to recur unless the necessary steps are taken to render the country habitable. And he says, if you want to do it, you need to eradicate the mosquitoes because they transmit the parasite that causes the disease, and it was a very major change from what happened in Palestine before the 1920s. I will get to that shortly. Kliegler also discussed the efficacy of using a different approach, which is distributing pharmaceuticals, especially quinine prophylaxis. And he says it's bad. It's just not it's not an efficient method. He says that distributing pharmaceuticals is a long drawn process requiring the goodwill and cooperation of the patient. And even then, efforts are not always crowned with success, and new patients are meanwhile added to the list. The attack on the mosquito strikes at the heart of the problem and at once eliminates the agency that perpetuates the disease. So his solution was basically simple, and it means, he said, we need to import to Palestine scientifically proven means of eradication. He wrote, the really effective method is to destroy the breeding of the mosquitoes. The measures to be adopted are those successfully employed by General Gorgas in Panama and Cuba. So it's basically draining swamps, digging ditches, creating canals that will prevent mosquito breeding. Using pharmaceuticals is basically something that you should do only when you have no other option, when it's definitely just the last line of defense. But he says in an article that he publishes, he calls quinine decidedly harmful. You shouldn't use it. What he says is that it maintains a level of latent infection in the body. So if you distribute quinine and then you stop, people would relapse. So it will get them on their feet, but it won't solve the problem, right? And what you need to do is to solve the problem. Now, I don't want to create the impression that Kliegler based his decision only on Panama. But Panama was his primary source of justification. Okay, he's a scientist. He publishes in the best journals possible. He writes a book in 1930, published in the Chicago University Press. If I will do that, I might get tenure one day, maybe. So he's a scientist. He's well aware of the global lessons of malaria eradication, and they come from experiments or from events all over the world, but Panama is his primary justification. So he also articulates his decision in the broader malariology world, and he said that one of the greatest lessons from World War I, or one of the greatest disappointments, as he calls it, was the failure to check malaria on practically all the southern fronts, which basically means Albania, Macedonia, Mesopotamia, and Palestine. And he said the armies during World War I tried quinine, but it failed. So this is another reason why we shouldn't distribute pharmaceuticals. Okay. He's also basically saying the criteria for success, when he talks about Panama, he says the criteria for success in the building of the Panama Canal was the eradication of the mosquito. The same criteria conditions the success of rebuilding our home in Palestine. If you want to build a state, you need to eliminate the mosquitoes, not to work on people's bodies and distribute medication. Okay. Whoops. And this is, again, why he comes to the same conclusion that quinine is undesirable and you should use it only if there is no other choice. It comes up frequently in the unit's reports. The unit writes that it relied on quinine very little and that it's skeptical of its value, and so on and so forth. In 1923, Kligler publishes an article where he dismisses the use of quinine. That's an important one. I will get back to that once again. I will get back to that shortly. But Kligler was not the only one that conjured the image of Palestine, of Panama, sorry. When Louis Brandeis came back to the United States after his visit in 1919, the visit that started the whole process, he gave this talk in Chicago that I mentioned, and his colleague, Jacob de Haas, his colleague and friend, says that some of the delegates, they were so confused by what Brandeis is saying and why is he talking about malaria, because they didn't understand that, that's a quote from de Haas, that Brandeis proposed to begin operations in Palestine like Gorgas began his work in the Panama Canal. So they're well aware of Panama in what they're doing in Palestine. Okay, Panama informs decisions about Palestine. But how are things before the unit? If I'm saying Panama informed the decisions, what happened before that? You know who this guy is? Maybe you heard his name, Hillel Yaffe. Hillel Yaffe was one of the main malaria fighters before the mandate period. He was famous for his work in Hedera, where the Hillel Yaffe Hospital is, where I was born, actually. He was born in 1864 in Russia. He was involved with Russian revolutionaries for a while. He studied medicine in Geneva and then malariology in Italy, and he applied his knowledge in Palestine. And he is described as perhaps the first of the Jewish physicians to come to grips with these lurking dangers in the swamps. So he's one of the first Jewish physicians that understood the dangers of malaria. And if it looks, if you're asking yourself, why are you focusing on one person, then this one person, if he's treating the Jewish population, then prior to World War I, there was about 80,000 Jews in Palestine, and after that, 56,000. So one doctor matters, okay? There weren't many. Scientifically, Jaffe advocated the same method that Kliegler so vehemently opposed. He said, we have to distribute quinine. So they are opposites, right? Jaffe says quinine, Kliegler says mosquito. Okay, and he also initiated an active program of quinonization, as one scholar called it in Hedera. But Jaffe was on the losing side of this scientific debate, because Kliegler presented his findings in one of the government's, the British government's agencies, and the method of eradicating the mosquito rather than distributing quinine basically prevailed. It became the dominant method, and Jaffe was livid. I mean, it's not even anger. He was totally furious about Kliegler's arguments, and he publishes a 1925 article, which is nothing but a direct assault on Kliegler's approach. I mean, he's angry and it's personal, okay? I mean, you know, you read it and you really see the kind of clash of egos also, regardless of scientific details. So Jaffe publishes this article in 1925, and if you remember, I just said that Kliegler wrote an article in 1923 where he dismisses quinine. Then Jaffe makes direct references to that particular article by Kliegler. It's personal, okay? And here's what Jaffe writes about these scientific changes in eradicating malaria. He writes, lately, probably under the general tendency in medicine to criticize many of the science's principles, we often see negative attitudes to views that we already accepted based on many years of scientific experiments. There is no doubt that the value of criticism in medical questions is great since it advances science, but sometimes it is unfruitful because of the aspiration to novelty and contrary opinions that are not scientifically, that are not sufficiently founded. Out of some lightheadedness, a different view was accepted and vociferously declared of the uselessness of quinine prophylaxis. So you can see that he's not happy about it, but that it was a major shift from the way that malaria was treated before. Eradicating mosquitoes or focusing on mosquitoes, having this your primary enemy, was a major shift. And we also have it from other accounts. Sandra Sufyan, which is a historian that wrote a book about malaria eradication, and Tzvi Salitarnik, that was a former member of the MRU and later high-ranking official in the Israeli Department of Health. They basically both described how widely quinine was used and what they called malariomania in Palestine. Many doctors in the country believed in the power of the drug, and they basically used it for everything that induced fever, which means that you could have had the flu and they would give you quinine. Wouldn't help, okay? They used to treat even conditions like typhus, influenza. Whenever they saw fever, they said malaria, quinine, period. It was widely distributed both to treat epidemics and for prevention. It was made available for purchase at post offices between 1919 and 1921. And it became what Sandra Sufyan called a household remedy. And they also used it, not only that they used it whenever someone had fever, they also didn't have a standardized dose. So you're sick, you have I don't know, fever, here's quinine, just like, you know, whatever comes. Go ahead. Sufyan also recounts a case when a doctor prescribed quinine to a sick girl even though her blood test for malaria was negative, so he tested, he knew it wasn't malaria, and he still gave her quinine. When her fever did not decrease, that doctor consulted a different doctor that came from today's Istanbul, and the doctor who came from Turkey told him it's not malaria, it's typhus. And why do you give quinine if the blood tests for malaria are negative? So that doctor didn't really have anything to say, but the only thing that he answered was, but in any case, it was malaria. Okay, so they insisted on malaria and quinine. All that happened before the unit. Now, for Hillel Yaffe, he justified his scientific method in experiments that were made in Italy, in Romania, in Sicily. Just like Kligler, he looked all over. But his main justification came from India. Okay? He writes, just a few years ago, there was a revolution in healing malaria after the famous inquiries of the Dr. Acton in India that acknowledged the great difficulty in treating tertian malaria, which is a variant of malaria, and stated his opinion with the needed humbleness as appropriate to a wise man of science. At that time, if I'm not mistaken, I was the only one in the country to address the issue, and it is a wonder that this true view of the Dr. Acton did not gain support among the doctors in our country, so its influence is unfelt. What he's basically saying is they all used to use quinine, and then he said during the 1920s we had these revelations in India, so he's same way Kligler is saying we need to look at what happened in Panama, Yaffe is saying we need to look at India, but it's not working anymore. Okay, the method that was used in Panama is now institutionalized, and this is the dominant way to eradicate malaria. So Yaffe is building on Dr. U. Acton. These days, I don't know what do you do, but if I see a figure that I don't know and I want to know how important they was, the best way to test it is if they have a Wikipedia page. So Dr. Acton doesn't have a Wikipedia page yet, but he was, just to give you a little bit of background on who Yaffe is relying, he was a major at the IMS, the Indian Medical Service. He worked in northern India, and he was later a doctor in the School for Tropical Medicine and Hygiene in Calcutta. Just so you know, it didn't really help Yaffe because he lost the scientific debates. Okay. I would want to shift to Pfeffer Valley now, to the case study that I looked at. So the reason I'm focusing on Pfeffer Valley, besides the fact that I was born, raised, and lived there until I came to the US, is that Pfeffer Valley, its lands were bought in 1929. And if you recall, the unit was disbanded it started disintegrating from the second half of the 1920s, the Malaria Research Unit. It had cutbacks in personnel, in budget, and it deteriorated. Its final deterioration was the early 1930s. But when Pfeffer Valley's lands are bought, there's still malaria there, as in other places in Palestine. And what happens is that many inspectors that worked in the Malaria Research Unit now move to other organizations or to bodies like the Jewish National Fund, because the Jewish National Fund said, we had the Malaria Research Unit. It focused on Jewish settlements, but now our settlements are still suffering from malaria, but we don't have the service to provide them. We don't have the anti-malarial service. So we would hire the inspectors from the unit that were now fired, right, or stopped, their work was terminated, right? And we would hire them as anti-malarial inspectors. And the inspector that worked in the unit, in the valley, sorry, his name was Israel Yolos. Yolos was an inspector in the malaria research unit. So he basically moved to the unit, to the Jewish National Fund, and sent to Pfeffer Valley to continue his work because it was still highly malarious. Morbidity rates, I took the figure of 70%. Some people say 100 during the early days. That's probably because there were only 80 people in the valley during the early days and they were all sick. There was also an Arab population in the valley. I don't have statistical data for them, but evidence suggests that they were also very ill. Now, if you remember these two photos that I started with, so what's in common with the Panama Canal and the Alexander Stream in Pfeffer Valley, and what does Grisha have to do with it? What you can see in the case of Pfeffer Valley is that also after the unit was disbanded, the same methods from Panama persist. They do not even consider distributing pharmaceuticals. I didn't see any reference to that. Even at times where situation is really bad, even in the first days of the Jewish settlement in the valley, when there's only 80 people and they cannot drain the swamps and the bodies of water on the land because there was a legal dispute about the purchase of these lands, they still do not use quinine. So they stick even more vehemently to like not distributing pharmaceuticals. Okay? They fight mosquito breeding, not quinine. It's the lessons of Panama. They get institutionalized. Even after the unit, they get implemented in other places in order to have a healthy population that can actually, start its life somewhere new. Okay. By the way, in about 1934, 1935, morbidity rates in the valley decreased from like 70 to 26 to 3%. So they're getting like good control of malaria pretty soon. That's it for the part of knowledge of the talk. So just to recap quickly, the method was based off of experiments or achievements in Panama and other doctors that advocated, drawing on lessons from India, which is Yaffe lost the battle. So you have a doctor coming from the US and implementing a certain method in Palestine, and it has very important consequences for the Zionist project. About practice, I have to say that this, what I'm going to present now was very, very confusing for me. One of the practices, ways of organizing the anti-malarial operations that you can see is basically relegating responsibility for anti-malarial operations to the population and saying it's the inhabitants' responsibility, it's their individual responsibility. For me, as an Israeli, it's mind-blowing. I'm used to descriptions of a very strong state, what is called big government, not small government, not relegating responsibility, but a lot of power, a lot of intervention. So seeing these themes and how, Jewish or Zionist institutions basically relegate responsibility was basically very counterintuitive. And both the British and the unit drew on notions of self-care, self-help, and self-support when they discussed the organization of the anti-malarial operations. So it was kind of a shared modus operandi, I would say. And these three might be a little different, but they basically all say we are relegating responsibility to the population. It was also enacted by law. the British enact the 1922 Anti-Malarial Ordinance, and they say it's the inhabitants' responsibility to prevent mosquito breeding on their land. If they don't do it, you can either get fined or get incarcerated for about 2 weeks. So it's the resident's responsibility, and if not the resident, then the landlord's responsibility. And if not, you know, you might do jail time. I'll start with the Department of Health. So a relatively late report of the Department of Health from the 1940s mentions self-help as one of the main principles that had always informed anti-malarial operations in Palestine. They write, throughout the country, action has always been taken, and since the application of the Malaria Ordinance insisted on it, to see that the people themselves prevent as much mosquito breeding as possible. The British rhetoric concerning the eradication of the disease also aimed at redeeming the inhabitants from what the British saw as their poor state. And the British wrote that the government stated that malaria made the country's population dwindle and turned it apathic, an easy prey for the disease and the mosquito, and it degraded to waste agricultural tracts. And after the British took over Palestine, the government sought to ameliorate conditions through activities carried by the people themselves through their own vigor. So it's very much like the people will do the job. The Malaria Research Unit followed a principle that they called self-care or self-support. And in a report they wrote pretty early, Kliegler with his bacteriologist colleague, Weitzman, they said that malaria control could be achieved even in places that are very, very malarious, where you have high morbidity rates. And they recommended constant treatment of the infected zone by the settlers themselves in order, and that's a quote, to protect the inhabitants against their own negligence and indifference, and inculcate the habit of proper self-care. So they also use the language of self-care. Okay. They also mentioned that the inhabitants should cooperate with various agencies when they drain swamps, and you can see it repeating in the unit's reports, that there's constant collaboration between individuals in certain places, in certain Jewish areas, and, for example, the Jewish National Fund in undertaking anti-malarial operations. The theme of self-care or self-support when it comes to the unit was also anchored in a broader effort to educate the Jewish population about the disease. If you recall, or if you know a little bit about the demographic background of the people who came to Palestine at the time, they came from Europe. They had no idea what malaria is. This is one of the reasons why when they got it really bad, because they weren't exposed to the disease. It's considered a tropical disease. You don't really have it in Poland, right? So Kliegler mentions that, he mentions the importance of educating the population about the disease a number of times. And basically lectures were given to the population about the importance of controlling malaria and the methods that you would use to do so. A special health day was set up to instruct school children about the disease. They took them to tours around like their village, show them this is a possible breeding place, this is what you do to get rid of it. And Kliegler also writes that throughout the year, a malaria inspector would visit various delinquent families and impress them with the dangers resulting from their carelessness. So if some family didn't eradicate mosquito or prevented breeding like Kligler had wanted or the MRU officials wanted, they would send someone to their door to frighten them, basically. This form of organization did not confine itself just to nurturing habits. The Malaria Research Unit developed what they called self-supporting malaria districts, which basically means that the MRU organized settlements and organizations that could afford it to pay for some of the burden of anti-malarial initiatives. So for example, in Athlete, the electricity company paid for the expenses. In Migdal, the anti-malarial inspector's salary was paid by the locals, the MRU paid for the materials. Once again, it's the theme of self-help, and it exists through the unit's early days. In one of his early reports, Kligler mentions, he basically said, we saw that there's breeding places that the population itself can eradicate, so why not? And he said most of the villages are too poor to spend money for anti-malarial work, but all of them can give labor if some agency is ready to furnish the funds for tile, for example. In this way, various communities may participate to the extent of 1/3 to 1/2 of the actual cost of drainage, and he mentions certain cases where it actually happened. How am I on time? I need to wrap up? Okay. So how was this transnational? How does this show the circulation of practice? If you remember, I started with Louis Brandeis. Brandeis himself is very many times described as believing in the idea of self-help. Historians that had looked at his biography, ties it to a belief in Puritan ideas. He was what they call a New England man. He said, we need to make men and women self-supporting in Palestine. The first thing to do is to get rid of malaria. And this is why we formed the anti-malarial research unit. So it's very much a part of making people self-supporting for him. For the British, as I said, it was a part of economizing. They just didn't want to pay. You relegate responsibility, great. You don't need to pay for that. The part that I'm also working on when it comes to the malaria research unit and doctors that are using this method is basically based off historians of medicine that say that self-help was a tradition in Anglo-American medicine. From the early days of the American frontier, where you didn't have doctors everywhere, people had to rely on themselves to treat diseases. Okay? So it's very much, it's coming from the United States. It's a common theme also in Britain, though here I think the economic incentives for the British are very big. Okay. In the valley, I will be very brief because I don't really have time. In the valley, you can see that the self-care, self-help, self-support framework is also used there. In the first 2 years, the Jewish National Fund pays £7,000 for the eradication of malaria. The inhabitants are the one doing the work. But after 2 years, the Jewish National Fund say, we won't pay for this anymore. We're only paying for the inspector, only paying Yolos' salary. So now it's up to the settlements, now it's up to the kibbutzim and the moshavim there to pay a certain tax that their local committee introduces, and this is how the operations will be financed. The thing about this committee is that it doesn't have official power. It's a voluntary committee. These committees didn't really have political power. So when the committee asks for money, people can give, but they don't have to. Okay? And you have certain like moshavim or kibbutzim that just won't pay. So the local committee in the valley that is in charge of all the valley's interests, all the different settlements' interests, they are basically crying out for money. They say we cannot undertake these operations if we don't have money, and their rhetoric just like they become more and more desperate as time goes. They really have to fight, and they sometimes just don't get the funds, and they threaten that there will be outbreaks and so on and so forth. I can address that in the Q&A if you want. Here's the thing. Here's why self-help is important. This is today's local council. This is the building, not a committee, a council. Here's why it's important. Because in 1935, the British authorities and some of the Jewish or the Zionist political institutions are thinking about forming official local councils that will have official political power. Not like the committee. The committee did not have official power. And they choose Pfeffer Valley as one of the places to form such council, because they say, we like the way the committee operates. I don't really know why, but they like it. And the committee is terrified of becoming an official local council because it means that the British will have a lot of power over them, okay? So they will have political power, but the British will be able to dismiss the council if they want. But one of the people who was involved in the committee basically says, our reason to go for this status and to have real political power is because we needed that power. We needed power to levy taxes. We just couldn't take the financial burden that is associated either with anti-malarial initiatives or with other expenses that we had, but we just couldn't keep operating without making people pay taxes. So the process that I'm trying to stress here is how self-care, self-help practice were brought into Palestine, institutionalized with the unit, then in Pfeffer Valley, and it's basically relegating responsibility again in the valley that forces the committee in a way to become the first local council in Palestine. They just don't have a choice. If it's on them, they need the power to levy taxes, and it's this self-help theme that makes them become the first, or is a big part of their decision to become the first local council in Palestine. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Omri. I think we all learned a tremendous amount. I just want to add one comment, and that is that a piece that might be connected, might not be connected, is the operating philosophy of the joint at that time, which was to help local communities help themselves. So that might have been an added ingredient there. I don't know that for a fact. We have time for some questions. I saw a few hands go up. Please, in the back.
So I'd like to ask whether Brandeis, after he left the formal leadership of the Zionist movement in 1921 when he had the split with Weitzman, he developed a whole organization, the Palestine Development Corporation, PDC, and I was wondering whether they were operating and funding some of these anti-malaria programs, or if you connected anything to that, because that organization continued to invest, as did the JDC, outside of the World Zionist Organization. It's hard to believe, but in the 1920s, Jews didn't all get along.
Yeah. Thank you. So basically what I know about Brandeis was very active. I mean, he allegedly, the whole narrative of, you know, American Zionism losing the battle for Zionism. It's not, I mean, sure, if you want to focus on just politics, but if you want to focus on health, it's like, it's an American win, right? Health and development. I know that Brandeis was involved, if I'm not mistaken, with the Palestine Economic Corporation. Yes. So it was more of a funding mechanism, I would say, based on what I know, but they did fund some companies. So it was more, again, based on what I know now, it's an indirect involvement in anti-malarial initiatives through funding a company that was called, for example, I think it was the Haifa Bay Corporation. So it's development companies, and they also do malaria eradication. But they were very much into, I mean, he was a progressive politician on top of all of his, you know, he was a fascinating person, right? And he's very much pushing economic development. So through that, yes.
David?
It would seem to me that land that's infested with malaria would be cheap.
Yes.
So what was the role in state development of buying this cheap land? How much land really was, you know, in the purchase of land, how much was purchased that was malaria infested and how much wasn't, for example? How did that lead to state development?
The best answer is not in this presentation. It's on my computer, so I can show it to you. It will take me about a minute. There is a map that shows areas that were heavily infested with malaria in 1920, I think. But it's a really good map because it takes the high infection areas of 1920 with the state of Jewish settlement in 1947. And you can see an incredible correlation between what they called the Jewish N, so the coastal plain and the northern valleys, and malaria. This land, at least based on what the malariologists in the Department of Health say, it was cheap. It was cheap. It was cheaper to get because it was infected with malaria, because you have people who don't know malaria, and they come and they see a land that is agricultural, that is full of water, and they say, oh, good, we'll buy, and it's cheap. You know, we'll get this one. And then, bam. You know, there's a reason why it's cheap. You know, you buy cheap, you pay dearly. You know, there's a saying in Hebrew, "Mi shekoneh bezol meshalem beyoker." Okay, so that it was definitely a part of that. It was at least what they're saying, the malariologists and the British officials. One of them is saying the first pioneers had suffered, but it wasn't in vain because it's land that is good for development. So he's basically saying they got malaria really bad, but they can develop the land. And also, what they're saying is like achieving it getting it cheap for cheap. Yeah, we'll start.
Yeah, you mentioned the British. The British could have helped, obviously, pay for some of this.
Yes.
If they were in charge, but they didn't. Did the British help the Arab populations in any way with public health?
They did. They usually stress that they help everyone. That's at least their official rhetoric. But again, it might be a little generalizing, but their initiatives are usually not good enough because the British care for the British and they care for the British administration. They were in charge of eradicating malaria in the cities. So they do the work there, but whenever they can avoid spending money, they would. So they do treat the Arab population to a certain extent, but it's never, it's part of the reason why the MRU was formed, because it wasn't good enough. Okay, it's not, the Arab population mostly had to rely, based on what I know, on like charity institutions. And the malaria research unit also took care of the Arab population in certain cases. Yeah, and then, yeah.
So I'm fascinated by this for the reason that I knew nothing about it. And it sounds like after the malaria was taken up in the way that it had been presented successfully by Panama, that it became a foundation for settlement, which then expanded into those areas and laid the foundation for the state of Israel. But I'm also wondering whether or not the methods that you described as being put upon those settlers to take care of themselves was also a method that was incorporated into the settlement themselves, the kibbutzes and the other farming communities that arose from there. Was that a foundational part of it as well?
Yeah, that is something that I will still have to dig into. What I can say is, for example, when it comes to the valley, and the valley forms its local council, they have a constitution. And the constitution says, it says mostly stuff about levying taxes and how everyone should pay, even if they're not in the valley. I know that every kibbutz, every moshav, everyone, they had like their own guy that was in charge of eradicating malaria. But what I would also say is that once you have a political body that is forcing, the inhabitants to take control of that, it's no longer the same, because you do have now political intervention, right? There is, if certain local government institutions come and say, hey, you have to do that because I'm ordering you and I'm using my power, and the inspector works for me and all that, it's slightly different. I would think that it was slightly different, but I still need to look into that. Thank you. Yeah.
In the United States, they needed to get people to come over and immigrate, and they would send out flyers to Europe that would basically say that America was the land of milk and honey. And then you get over here and there's Native Americans and different things like that, as far as challenges that are not in the propaganda that's put forth. I'm kind of curious if you see that with this time frame where there's not the discussion of malaria or it's downplayed so that you will encourage immigrants to come in.
I'll start with the economic question, with the economic, your first question. Based on what I know, Hillel Yaffe was a physician. He wasn't really involved in industry. Quinine is, one of its main centers is Indonesia. I don't know of any economic interests that he had. He is saying that it's basically, even if you want to eliminate the mosquito, the people who advocate eliminating the mosquito would still say that you need to treat parasite carriers, like people who already, so you will have to treat the body rather than eliminate breeding places. And he says, it's basically impossible. How can you detect each and every parasite carrier, take them out of like the high morbidity areas, treat them and bring them back? So he's basically saying, like, Kligler is saying that what I'm doing is impossible, but I'm saying that what he want to do is also impossible, because he's also saying that another one of the another component of eradicating malaria, even if it's only secondary, is treating people, right? Treating the body. So this is why we should use quinine. But I don't know of any economic interests that he had. When it comes to propaganda, I would assume again, I would assume, based on what I've seen, is that the theme of milk and honey is, it's also used in like Eretz Israel's case. I know that the people who got sick in Palestine, the Zionists in Palestine who got sick, many times saw it as a rite of passage. It was a sign of bravery. We got it now, so maybe this was used somehow. But based off what I know, it was, and assume, it was probably presented as a land of opportunity. Brandeis also says there's a land, if I'm not mistaken, he's saying something like rich in opportunities, poor in actualities, something like that. So you need to develop, and it would be great, right? But you need to get rid of malaria, but it can be great, okay? So, yeah. We'll start with you. Yeah.
Did the Jewish settlers in this valley, did they hire hydrology engineers, people who knew how to drain swamps? And where the water goes up, you all know water flows downhill, and you're already in the valleys. And where did they put the water?
Yeah, that's a great question. Basically, Yolos knew. He made schemes. So the Malaria Research Unit also developed schemes, and Yolos have a lot of documents where he says, we need to dig here, make it 60 centimeters. And he's working with an engineer in the Jewish National Fund. So he's actually sending each month reports of the anti-malarial situation in the, how the swamps are, how many sick people, how many mosquitoes he counted in each and every place. And he sends it to the office of the chief engineer of the Jewish National Fund, I think. I wasn't able to track that person yet. He also doesn't have a Wikipedia page, unfortunately. But I might be able to in the future, and that would actually be great. I will definitely try. Yeah.
What proportion of Palestine, as it was defined, was malaria infested?
The way, I wouldn't necessarily say that, each and every spot, but, above the Negev, above the desert, you had malaria in the plains and valleys, but you also had malaria in the hills for different reasons. In the hills, it was mostly because of cisterns. In the valleys, it was mostly swamps. Malariologists, and it relates to your question about hydrology, they knew a lot. And they knew a lot because you need to know geographical and topographical features of a country. And, they measure rainfall and averages of rainfall and patterns of rainfall. So they know a lot, and a lot of places in the valleys, in the hills, had malaria. You had malaria sometimes in places, you don't need water to have malaria. Because if someone has parasites in their blood and a mosquito bites them and then they bite a healthy person, that too can transmit malaria. So it was very, very rife. But I would assume mostly in the places that had water rather than in the south. Yeah.
Thank you, Omri, and thank you everyone for coming. I hope you enjoyed our program today. How many of you knew about malaria? Yes, okay. And the connection of the joint and American experts? Okay. Yeah. I'd like to extend thanks to the Center for Jewish History, especially Julie Kaplan and Judy Greenspan for their co-sponsorship today. And I'd like to thank you all, draw your attention to some of the promotional materials outside about upcoming programs, about some of our publications. And thank you very much for coming out on a cold day. Thanks.
Yeah. Just one last thing. I grew up on stories that swamps were drained with eucalyptus trees, and it was heartbreaking to see in 1920 an official British decision that no eucalyptus ever drained any swamp. Basically, it took me a few days to recover, but if you ever heard of eucalyptus trees, they don't really do the job, right? I mean, I'm sorry. It was hard for me too.